All right, so today we're going to talk about the myths and realities of product management. So before I start, I want to get to know you guys a little bit better. How many of you are thinking about becoming a product manager? Okay, it looks like about half of you. What about the other half? You guys were just dragged along or other reasons? Okay, so from the people who want to be product managers, how many of you are engineers currently? Okay, designers, marketing, sales. Cool, so we got a pretty good mix, so we'll have a fun time discussing some of these topics. So you guys, so I know you guys a little bit more. I want to talk to you about me, who I am. And the reason I bring this slide first is everything I'm going to talk about tonight is going to come with my biases, right? I have a certain set of experiences as a product manager. I'm going to talk about the myths and realities. You might talk to another product manager who's maybe smarter than me, and he might disagree with me on some of these things. So it's important for you to understand, what are my experiences, where have I worked as a product manager, and what do I bring, what is kind of the asterisk on every slide which says, this is just my experience, it may not be the truth. So my journey started off in Toronto, Canada. I grew up there. I did a bunch of startups there, the most prominent up there being Row 1 Sports. That was an app that lets you play along with live sports. So you're watching a baseball game. It'll push questions to your phone. You'll be able to answer them in real time, compete with your friends. It was a lot of fun, but then I ran out of money, and then it wasn't as fun. So I decided I needed to get a job, and that's where I ended up in Seattle, working for Microsoft. At that time, I had no idea what product management was, and I decided, what can I do? What are my skills? I don't really know. I did have an engineering degree, so that helped. So I actually started off being a software engineer at Microsoft. I quickly realized that it doesn't really have the same pull as the startup world did, where I did both coding and product and marketing and business and all that. So I decided, you know what, it's time to switch to product management. So I was in many of your shoes not too long ago with the same thoughts in my head. Should I do it? What does it even mean? And I got a lot of different opinions on what it is and whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. So I'm hoping this talk will at least help clarify in your head, is this a good idea for me based on my skills, based on my experiences? So at Microsoft, I worked on a product called Cortana. Cortana is a digital assistant. You may or may not know of it, but I'm sure you know of Alexa, which currently leads to space. So Cortana was Microsoft's competitor to Alexa. So I worked on that for a little bit. Last year, I moved out here to the Bay Area to work for Google. I work on their apps team, so calendar, Gmail, all that stuff. Having a great time here. I also realized that the first two cities had a giant tower in it, and the third one does not. Purely coincidental. All right. Why you are here, hopefully. First reason I think you're here is you want to answer the question, do I want to be a product manager? Right? It's a very fair question. You may have heard, you may have been to product schools, other events, you may have attended a bunch of the classes, but you're not really sure. It's a big move to transition your career and let go of all the skills you had previously and move into a new role. So hopefully I'll help clarify that. The second is, maybe you've decided that you do want to be a product manager, but you've got a bunch of different offers, or maybe you're thinking about which company to apply to. And one of the things about product management, it's relatively a new role. Different companies have different definitions, you could say, of what they do day to day. And you may want help deciding, which one do I pick? Which one is actually product management? Which one is the one that I would excel in? So hopefully we'll answer some of those questions as well. The third one is, who should I hire as a product manager? I don't know if this applies to any of you, but maybe you're hiring for product management roles and you're like, I don't really know what a product manager does or should be doing. How do I pick between these two candidates? So hopefully you'll get to know a little bit more about that as well. Is there a fourth reason someone is here? The beer? No? All right. Product manager. What is a product manager? I like this slide because the headless chicken, people tell me I do that at work, so it is actually true. But let's start with our first true or false question. Product manager has no definition. What do you guys think? Is that true? Is there like a single definition that everyone kind of agrees on? Be like, this is a product manager.
Depends on what industry.
Okay, let's talk about tech, because we're in Silicon Valley. So in tech, would you say product manager has a definition, doesn't have a definition? There is a confusion though. A lot of people don't understand what product management is, even though it has a definition. Why is that? The reason is because this definition is very vague, right? What does it mean, success of a product? What does that even mean? The problem is that it could mean different things at different companies and also different parts of the product lifecycle, right? It could mean that you're doing strategy and visioning and all sorts of cool business stuff And that's what it takes to make the product successful. Could also mean you're bringing in donuts for the rest of the team because they're hungry. Could help with the success of the product, right? And that's where kind of the disparity comes from. It's not that the definition doesn't exist. It's that for different phases of the product, you're going to be doing different things. All right, so here's another true or false question. Founders and hackers make the best product managers. So you may have heard, or you may have met product managers, and maybe most of them were founders and hackers. Is that a coincidence? I would say it is not, right? I would say this is actually true. And wait, I'm not saying if you're not a founder or a hacker, you can't be a product manager. But founders and hackers have certain characteristics, which if you think you have those characteristics, you'd actually make a great product manager. One of those characteristics is the bias for action. So I'm sure all of you have jobs, you work in companies. Everybody in a company has an opinion. Everybody in a company has a certain expertise. And their job is to figure out, okay, based on what I do, how should the product look like? What should I focus on to make sure I get whatever it is I need from based on me being an engineer or me being a designer, whatever I do into the product. For a product manager, if the product doesn't get to the end user, if it doesn't get to the customer, you failed. That's it, right? Doesn't matter whether it was engineering's fault or design fault or who did what, it's your fault. The product didn't ship, it's your fault, right? And so having a bias for action is critical, right? If you're someone who's like, I want to get it out there, I want to get it in front of customers, I want to have it real, I want to make it real and show it to people. That is what it takes to really get things out the door. If you don't have that wired into your system, there's going to be a million people who are going to say, you can't do it because, or this is going to take a year, this is going to take a month, right? And so it takes that. And I've found that founders and hackers generally have that capability because they've been through that. They've been through that experience. The second is always be learning and doing, right? And this is unique to founders and hackers, but this concept of learning and then doing, right? It's actually pretty unique. There's a lot of people that love learning, right? They read books, they listen to articles, they listen to videos. They love to learn. They love the idea of knowing something. And then there's other people that just want to do, right? But this combination of learning and doing and knowing when to switch, right? Knowing that, okay, I've learned enough, now I have to go do something. This is critical for product management, right? And you may already do this in your role. If you do, great. If you don't, you're going to have to learn that skill. It's very hard to know when to switch from learning to doing. And that's, I think, critical. The last one is being strong-willed and resilient. As a product manager, you're going to have a lot of times where your product, you worked on it for a year, it gets cut, or it gets merged with some other product, or you launch it and it fails, right? And as an engineer or as a designer, you may still be okay. You may still get a promotion. You may still be, learn something and do something and contribute to the world because what you did as an engineer is still important. It's still something that mattered to the engineering community or to the design community. As a product manager, if it doesn't ship, you didn't do anything really, right? Because the whole point of them hiring you was to ship something to get in front of users. And so that requires a certain level of resilience, right? To be beaten down so much and not lose hope. And to be told no to a million different times and still say, no, actually I still want to do it, we still have to do it. You may have cut my project, but I'm going to come next year and I'm going to release it anyway, even though you said no, right? And that's something I've found founders and hackers do very well. People who haven't been through that experience before, sometimes it's really very hard to process that kind of information and still kind of push forward. All right, let's get to the next. PM is the CEO of the product. If you've read the description, you already know the answer to this, but have you guys heard this before? PM is the CEO of the product? Yeah, you guys have probably all heard this. How many of you think it's true? Nobody?
Partially.
What's that?
Partially.
Partially, okay. Cool, I'll tell you why it's not true, and it looks like you guys already know it. When I was trying to decide product management, this was the #1 quote everybody told me. It's like, oh, it's the CEO of the product. And I was like, oh, that sounds cool, right? But actually, it's not true, right? First of all, no one has to listen to you, right? You don't really have any authority. When a CEO tells you to do something, you have to do it. There's no ifs, ands, or buts, right? When a product manager tells you to do something, you can ignore them and it will not matter to your career. Literally, if you're an engineer and a product manager says, do this, you can be like, no, and that's it. There's no repercussions for you, right? And so that's something very different from a CEO. The second is you can't fire or hire anyone. Somewhat related, but it actually has an interesting twist. This actually means you don't get to pick who you work with, right? When I was a founder, when I had my own startup, I got to pick who I work with, right? I was the CEO. I was like, I want to work with that guy. He seems cool. That guy's really smart. I want to work with him. Well, guess what? You don't get to choose who you work with as a product manager. You'll be given a team, and you're going to have to figure out, how do I work with these people? They may not gel with you the same way that your buddies do or your previous teammates do. And that's very different from a CEO. You don't have that control. You need to have the skill to be able to navigate that kind of environment. The third one, which really gets to my heart, there's no private jets or golden parachutes. I've been trying to convince Google to give product managers private jets, but it's like a waste of money or something. I don't know. All right. Good PMs don't obsess over detail. So this is something I've heard in many different forms. Some people tell me that I want to be a product manager because, naturally my thought process is high level. I want to focus on kind of the big picture, and I want to focus on the strategy. And there's people who are really good at the details, and I want to leave the details to them, and I want to focus more on the high level. So, somewhat true. But how many of you think this is true? Good PMs don't obsess over detail. You think it's true? No. Correct answer. It is a myth. Actually, 80% of your time is going to be spent on details. So I was an engineer before, and I thought I focused on details. There were different types of details, right? Product managers focus on product level details. You'll have to understand, like, all right, so there's a guy in France who's using my product, and his Wi-Fi is spotty, and there's a volcano eruption in Iceland, and it's raining, and the lightning strikes. What happens? Or someone's going to ask you that question, and you better understand whether it's an important question or not. And if it is an important question, how do you answer it? Right? Those details matter a lot. The big picture and business side of things, you'll do that too. But most of your time, it's going to be with these thorny problems. The thorny problems that are really, really critical to solve, and the answer is not obvious. Successful product does not equal a good product manager. This would probably apply to anybody who's trying to hire product managers. Actually, I'll tell you a story. I met someone who had worked on very, very successful products, right? This was someone who worked on products that shipped to millions of users. They were wildly successful, and he did it more than once, right? More than once. And I thought, wow, this guy must be really smart, really good product manager. Turns out they were not. In fact, I was like, how did they even end up on those products? And so the point is that don't think that success means good, right? It's not always good. In fact, you learn more from failures than you do from successes, right? If you succeeded, there could be a million reasons why. You don't know which one of them is true. If you failed, you probably know why you failed, because you did the research to figure out, why did I fail, and how do I learn from that mistake and do something differently. The second is personal impact is what matters, right? And this is key. Even when you're trying to become a product manager and you're on the hot seat trying to get interviewed for a job, focus on personal impact, right? It's not about, like, if I'm hiring a product manager, okay, fine, you worked on this amazing product, but what did you do personally, right? The product may have grown exponentially, but what did you do that impacted that? That's what really matters, right? So focus on that. EQ is more important than IQ. I've heard this one too. This is, right, people who say, or engineers mostly, I was an engineer, and this is kind of how I said it. EQ is more important than IQ. I like talking to people. I like having conversations with them. I like talking to users. I want to get in front of customers. I don't want to be an engineer who's trapped in an office, never interacts with customers. So, the corollary to that is, hey, are people skills more important than being smart, right? Another way of putting it is like, hey, I won't cut it out as an engineer. I said that. I won't cut it out as an engineer. Therefore, I want to be a product manager where I won't have to utilize those skills. I can use other skills, like people skills that I'm good at. Nope, it's a myth. IQ actually matters probably equally as much as EQ. Why is that? People skills are not the only skills you need. You must understand subject matter experts, right? As a product manager, you're going to be talking to the guy who runs AI at your company, right? That's the level you're talking about. If you don't understand what he's saying, he's not going to listen to you, you're not going to have any credibility, and you won't know how to make decisions. If you can't understand what he's saying, it doesn't matter, right? The second is information processing is hard. You're going to have a million different people you're going to meet with during the day, and they're going to tell you a million different things, right? About everything from marketing to sales to engineering to design, everything. How do you process all that? How do you know which part of that is important? How do you know how to string all of that together into a story that you're going to tell people? Right? That's really hard. It takes a long time. And so I've seen that people who have come from backgrounds that require that level of intellectual horsepower, when they transition to product management, it's easier for them. I'm not saying it's impossible for everyone else, but I've seen that that's where the struggle happens for people who haven't come from those backgrounds. They're like, man, I don't know like what to focus on. There's just so much going on. Even, they might be good at all the other aspects, but they won't necessarily be good at this aspect. The third is the ability to jump from low level to high level. And this kind of ties into my previous point about details, right? You're going to have, in the same meeting, you're going to talk about like a line of code, literally like a line of code. Like, should I do it this way or that way? And then you're going to have to map that to like, okay, what does that mean for the 5-year strategy of the product? Literally, this happens, right? How do you do that quickly to be able to make that decision? The decision might be trivial, but it has implications for the higher strategic direction of the product. And so you need to be able to do that, switch between high and low level. There exists such a thing as too much knowledge. Wow, heresy. How could there be too much knowledge? Do you think this is true? Is there such thing as too much knowledge, or is a product manager's job to get as much information as possible, and there can never be enough? True or false? True. It's true. There can be too much knowledge. Why is that? Because knowledge costs time, effort, and money. Right? As a product manager, you're hired to make decisions under ambiguity. If the company already had all the information to make a decision, there's no point in hiring you. Right? Anybody can make that. There are smart people at every company. And if all the information is available, anybody can make the decision. That's easy. Right? So the point is, right, as a product manager, you need to be able to understand what happens when I don't have that information. What do I do? How do I build my intuition about the industry or the customer or the product to be able to make those decisions and not spend my time just getting more and more and more information, right? That'll go on forever. You'll never ship the product, right, ultimately. Leave the expertise to the experts, right? That's the third point. You have people who know the engineering. You have people who know, the user experience. Don't try to understand everything they know. That's not your job. Your job is to listen to them and then string together the different pieces that the experts are using, right? So there's one thing to take away. There is such a thing as too much knowledge in product management. All right. Product management is all about politics. I actually hear this from people who don't want to be product managers. They're like, product management, like, just do politics all the time. That's useless. Why would you become a product manager? I hear that. What do you think? Is it all about politics? No. I would say yes, actually. It is all about politics. Every decision you make is political, right? If you're an engineer, if you're a designer, you don't have to worry about politics as much. You may have to worry if you want to get that promotion or something. It's this ugly thing that you have to do in order to succeed in life. In product management, there is a political ramification for every decision you make. And if you don't understand that, you will not be successful. You will not ship your product if you don't understand the political ramification for the decisions that you make. Politics is not always bad, right? And this ties to my third point, which is fight for the end user. Don't fight for yourself. Don't do politics because I want to succeed as a product manager. I want to ship my product. I want to, get a promotion. No, understand. You have a question?
You can finish your point.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was just saying that, politics is about understanding that you're working with people, right? You're not working with machines who make decisions with logic. You're working with people, and in order to succeed in your role working with people, you have to understand what are their motivations, why are they doing what they're doing, and how do you convince them to do something differently if you need to do that. And guess what? That's politics, right? Ultimately, that's politics. Yeah, I can give you an example. So, for instance, let's say that you have a product that you need to ship, right? And you work on that product, you've done the research, you're convinced that this is a market opportunity that the business needs to do, right? And you may be working with someone else at another part of the company who's also convinced that their product needs to ship, right? And for some reason, whatever the reason is, because of the business concerns, you can't ship both products at the same time. Ultimately, someone needs to make the call of which product to ship. And if all you're doing is showing data, right? Let's say you go into the meeting and say, here's all the data, here's the convincing argument of why I did it. Like, that's a magical fairy tale world. That's not how it works. You need to approach the other person, talk to them, understand their motivations, figure out why is it that they think their product is better than your product. Then go talk to their manager and see if they agree with them, right? Then go talk to their team and see, do they agree with them, right? You have to understand the people dimension, right? And I'm not saying like go and backstab the person and like ruin their project, but I'm saying understand the politics, right? You have to understand it in order to influence it, right? It's not about like go into politics and do all sorts of horrible things to ship your product. That's not what I'm saying. But if you're ignorant of it, then it'll catch you blindsided, right? your product won't ship. If you don't understand why the other person is on the side that they're on, and you walk into the meeting not knowing that, not knowing the people dimension of it, then you'll walk out of that meeting, regardless of whether you were right, regardless of whether you had the best data, you'll walk out of that meeting unsuccessful. So, does that answer your question? All right, product management is the most respected job in tech. I also hear this a lot from people who are not product managers, but I've never heard this from people who are product managers. So it is a myth for sure. Do you guys know what Blind is? Blind, so it's a app. It's an anonymous app. A bunch of tech companies in the Bay Area and otherwise use it to chat with each other. And so people on Blind, like there's companies from Google, Microsoft, Uber, everybody's on Blind, right? They all hate product managers, or like most of them hate product managers. So here's a screenshot that I took. It's someone from Uber. A product manager is, and the top voted answer is mostly useless. The second one is my definition for product manager, or the one that I pulled. So you can see, like, it's not the most respected job in tech, right? People in this room might feel that way, like including me, but it's not, right? Here's another screenshot. Are product managers actually needed? I hope so. Google to fire all PMs. What the bleep do they do anyway? Hope he wasn't talking about me. But my point is this. Why is this true, right? I just told you all the reasons why product management is important and how to be a successful product manager. Why is this true? It's because product management is really hard, right? It's really, really hard, and it's not for everybody. I don't even know yet if it's for me, right? Like, I don't know how, I can't call myself a successful product manager, right? I mean, I got the job, but that doesn't mean anything, right? It's possible that that person was actually talking about me. It's very hard to understand whether you're useful or not. You don't have a metric like the number of code lines that you shipped or the number of designs you created. You don't have anything like that. The only thing you have is, did I ship the product and did people use it? And even when you did that, remember my previous slide? Even if that happened, you don't know if it was you or your teammate, right? Could have been your teammate, you don't know. You succeeded, but you don't know why. There are certain metrics, but remember that, take the long-term view, right? Let's say you ship a product and it's successful. What if you lost the trust of your entire team while doing that, right? What if nobody respects you anymore because you cut corners and you play politics or whatever, right? And nobody likes you in the company anymore. You're not successful. I'm sorry, you're not, right? You shipped the product and fine, you made this one product successful, but you didn't build your credibility. You didn't build the connection that you need to succeed in the future, right? And so you're right, there are some metrics. It's not totally blind. But at the same time, it's not a fast feedback loop. It's not something you can look at a quarter or look at 2 quarters and be like, yeah, I'm doing a great job, right? And so that's why you end up in these situations. People who are smart, talented, who know they want to do product management, end up in these companies, try to be product managers, and realize, man, this is really hard, right? And it's not because they're stupid. It's not because that they don't have the skills. It's just there's just so many things you have to take into account, and you have to be okay with that. You have to be okay with being treated like a second-class citizen in some cases, right? You don't have authority. You're not the you walk into the room and everyone's like, oh, it's the product manager. That doesn't happen. Nothing would go wrong if you fired the PMs. That's why that guy wanted to fire the PMs. But I'll say this. The product manager is useful in certain situations, right? And I would say in small startups, right? Startups where 5 to 10 people who are trying to solve a problem, you don't need a product manager. There's no point to having one. The CEO is essentially doing the product, right? And they should. You don't need a product manager. Product managers are useful when, one, you have a large team, and it's not clear from an organizational point of view who should be focusing on the product, right? The CEO, like Sundar at Google, can't focus on like what Calendar is doing, right? Like he doesn't have time for that. So who's in charge of it? Is it the engineering manager? That's a decent option, but he's spending his time managing his engineering team. He can't talk to customers while doing that, right? So who's in charge of that part? And that's where the product management role comes in. And so if you don't have product managers, what ends up happening is you build things that people don't need, right? You build things that are cool, that might be amazing, but people don't need them. And then you launch a product that gets no usage. And this actually happens way more common than you think, right? So I used to be at Microsoft. This was a common complaint at Microsoft. Like people are building things that nobody wants to use. And you spent all this time and money building it, but nobody used it. And that's where the product management comes in. What really makes you sad, and I've done this, right, is there is a product manager and you ship something and nobody uses it. Then you kind of like, why did I do this again? Should I just not be a product manager? You'll get that feeling sometimes. So you got to be strong-willed and resilient. Okay. Product managers are paid more than engineers. Think so? Maybe? In tech, at least, no, it's a myth. And I was actually surprised to hear it because I was like, really? How much do you get paid? Oh, I'm not going to tell you how much I get paid. So why is that? It's rarely true at big companies. So I don't know about, so I'm talking about specifically Bay Area or West Coast, I guess, in tech. I don't know about other industries. I don't know about East Coast, everywhere else. But in tech, in the Bay Area, I guarantee you, the engineers you work with will be richer than you. Hope you're okay with that. Job options are also much more limited. When I was an engineer, I'd get emails every single day, multiple emails, come work at this company, come work at that company. And if I wanted to switch jobs, I could literally pick whatever I wanted to do in the world. I want to work on self-driving cars this year. Next year, I want to work on VR and AR. The year after that, I want to work on biology. Like, I could do that. I'm a software engineer. I'm in high in demand, and my skills are translatable. As a product manager, no. One is you're going to need domain experience in whatever field you go into. So like if I'm working on apps at Google, I can't just work on something related to biology. As a product manager, I can't do that. And the number of product management jobs available are also less than software engineering, for example. So you have to be okay with that. Like your decisions will now have consequences if you're coming from engineering or even design, right? You'll have less options of where you can go and what you can do. The third is work-life balance is not necessarily better. Sometimes, and actually everybody you work with will think it is because they'll see you in meetings all the time and maybe you'll leave at 5, but you'll leave at 5 because you're like, oh my God, my brain is exploding. And then you'll take an hour break and then you'll get back to work, right? Work-life balance is not necessarily better. I was an engineer and yes, I worked late hours in the day and I got paged at night when something broke. I worked as an engineer, I know how that feels. As a product manager, I'm just as busy. Not necessarily more busy, but just as busy. The entire time I'm at work, I'm talking to somebody, and it's tiring, right, to be able to do that 8 hours a day. And then I go home, and then I have to do my real work, quote unquote, which is writing documents, figuring out what the plan is, making decisions. So I really have 2 jobs. It's not better in work-life balance, nor is it better pay. So the glamour certainly turned out to be untrue. Good PMs are always in meetings. What do you think? A lot of people believe meetings are useless. What do you guys think? Are meetings mostly useless? Good PMs always in meetings? No? Yes. Yes, good PMs should be in meetings. Why? There is always opportunity for a good meeting. So why is that? So by meetings, I mean good meetings, right? There's a lot of bad meetings out there, right? And I've been party to them. Sometimes I'm the one who's been conducting them. Bad meetings exist, and they waste everybody's time. Don't do bad meetings. But at a company, there is a lot of opportunity for good meetings. What are good meetings? Good meetings are things that benefit everybody, right? And there's a lot of different types of meetings. You mentioned one-on-ones. Building relationships with people. Very important as a product manager, right? Very, very important that you build relationships with people that you may not directly work with today, but you will work with tomorrow, right? It's possible. So you need to be able to learn from them and talk with them and get to know them. Other types of meeting are just informational, right? Like maybe I'm working on something, somebody else in another part of the company doesn't know what I'm working on. It's useful for me to communicate that information. They may not need it right now, but it's better for you to open that dialogue than not open that dialogue. And then they can choose whether they want to continue it or not, right? They might say, hey, this half an hour was totally useless, please don't do it again. It's like, okay, fine. But as a product manager, your job is to open up those lines of communication between the company. One of the biggest problems companies have is informational silos, right? You have parts of the company that don't know what other parts are doing, and then they build the same stuff, and then you have 2 products shipping that do exactly the same thing. Or you have people who don't understand why each of, you have people in a political sense, you have 2 people who work on different teams and have distrust for each other. How do you fix that? You talk to them, right? And it's not like meeting with an agenda and notes. It's like, go out for lunch, right? That's a meeting. I'd count that as a meeting, right? And never eat lunch alone, right? There's too many people you need to talk to and get to know and understand and teach things to that you shouldn't be eating lunch alone, right? You should always find who's the best person I can eat lunch with today? It could be different people every single day of the year, every single day of the week. And find ways to help people, right? People. In your spare time, you can do all the document writing you want to do, right? In your spare time, you can make decisions, you can figure out what the strategy is, build your slide deck. You can do all of that at home. In the 8 hours a day you have, that's when everybody else in the company is there. And that's a critical time for you. It's not a critical time for most other people because they can do their work, their entire work alone, right? As an engineer, I could trap myself in an office and crank out, millions of lines of code. Not really, but, it's possible. But as a product manager, you can't do that. If you don't have input from the people you work with, you can't make decisions. You don't have the information, you don't have the credibility, you don't have the relationships to be able to influence them. And so use that time. Use the time that you're in the office. And people aren't going to schedule it for you, right? Nobody's going to necessarily come to you and say, hey, you're a product manager, do you want to talk to me? Like, no one's going to do that. It's your job to figure out, I should talk to this engineering manager, I should get to know this new person that joined the company, right? It should be your job to do that. So what makes a good product manager? I think it's these three things: empathy, humility, and intellect. And we talked a lot about some of these in the myths and realities, but I want to kind of dig deeper into each of them. What do I mean by empathy? A lot of other professions also require empathy. So for example, designers, right? You guys work with designers, some of you are designers, right? As a designer, especially a user experience designer, your job is to understand the user, understand how the user goes from step 1 to step 2 to step 3, how do they accomplish their task. So if you have designers, why do you need product managers, right? It's an obvious question. Your empathy actually extends beyond the end user. The end user is important, but you need to empathize with the engineering team that you work with. You need to empathize with the designer you work with. You need to empathize with the stakeholders who pay for the product. They may not be the end users, but they pay for your product, right? Sometimes you have products which one person pays for and the other person uses. So you need to empathize with all of those people, not just the end user. And that's where you really add value, right? Empathy is key. If you don't understand why someone is doing what they're doing, then you as a product manager are not doing a good job. It's totally up to you. Intellect, we talked about this one, right? It's not enough to just be a good people person. Maybe great for sales. I don't know, I've never done sales. Maybe it's great for sales. But intellect, I think, is definitely important. So don't come into product management thinking that people skills alone will be enough, right? And it doesn't necessarily mean like you're born with it or you're not. Sometimes all it takes is putting yourself in that position and feeling, am I comfortable, right? Ultimately about comfortable. Like I said, product management is not glamorous. It doesn't pay more. It's not some elite field that people are hiding from everybody else, right? It's not like that. It's good for some people and it's not good for other people. And if you want to know whether it's good for you, put yourself in the position of a product manager. Like all the myths and realities that I talked about, think back to your life and be like, have I experienced this? Have I been in a situation where I had to process a lot of information quickly and make decisions? Did I feel good about it, right? Did I come back home and feel excited? Or was I like, man, I never want to do that again? That's a good litmus test, right? Ultimately, it may not be right for you, but you could find some other position that's really great for you. Or you could say, yes, totally. All of these things, check, 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 check. Product management, that's what I'm doing tomorrow. Applying to 1,000 product management jobs. Good luck with that. The last one is very important, humility. Humility, ultimately, as a product manager, like I said, full information is not available, right? You don't have all the information you need to make a perfect decision. You need to always remind yourself of that. It's going to be very easy to learn to love your own voice, right? Every meeting you're going to walk into, your job is to make decisions, right? So someone's going to come to you with a problem, your first instinct is going to be, do it this way, because I know a lot, and I've done a lot of research, and I've talked to everybody in the company. Doesn't mean you're right? Doesn't mean you're right. The market tells you whether you're right or wrong. The research does not. So be humble. Sometimes the best ideas in meetings have not come from product managers. In fact, I would even say most times, right, in my experience, the best ideas for what the product should be doing, sometimes it comes from the designer who's in the meeting. It says, hey, I think we should do this. Sometimes it comes from the engineer. Like, you are not the person who holds all the good ideas. You're not the good idea machine, right? You should be an idea machine, but it doesn't mean that you're the only one who comes up with good ideas. So be humble, right? The designer might not know more about something that you don't, or the engineer might have a good idea that you didn't come up with. So be humble about that, and take everything that people say seriously and evaluate it against the mental models that you've built. Constantly do that. It's very, very hard to not, to fall into the trap. Does the product manager have to be involved in some technical decision? Or is it just the engineering team who handles the technical decision and the product manager just has to know what happened? Is how important, I guess, is your question? There's no right answer to that question. It depends from product to product, right? I would say in some cases, you will know when it's the right decision to be involved, right? Ultimately, it's the engineering team's decision, right? Agreed with that. Maybe you shouldn't be in the room. But sometimes it matters, right? Like, I'll give you an example. So the engineering team is deciding to move to a completely new infrastructure, right? And they want to build a new infrastructure that'll make them move faster, build things quicker and with less bugs, right? It's totally an engineering decision, but do you think it impacts product? Right? Of course it does, right? It's going to cause timeline delays. It's going to cause all sorts of potential restrictions to what you can do with the product. In that case, you probably want to be in the room, right? And by the way, you're not necessarily going to get invited to the room, right? And you may want to be in the room, and you will be told, no, you are not going to be in this room. And then you got to find another way of either getting that information or influencing that, right? And that comes back to politics, right? It's not politics for your career, it's politics for what's best for the product, right? Having an understanding of that. There is also a cost barrier to doing anything, right? Engineering wants to do X or Y, each of those have costs, and ultimately product should be involved to help guide the decision of like, these costs matter or these costs don't. In an ideal world, if you were the CEO, you might get away with that, but as a product manager, you will not, right? It's true, right? Ultimately, maybe for the product, you should be involved, you should have an opinion, and you should be able to say the costs matter or don't matter, but you're not always going to get that opportunity. And you have to know when to walk away, right? You can't push people, right? Ultimately, I've seen product managers who micromanage, right, engineering sometimes. Especially, I had that tendency because I switched from software engineering. I was like, oh, I know about coding. I could talk about coding. And you have to know when to walk away. And this comes back to, the politics and knowing the people dimension of how an organization works, right? You have to know that this decision may or may not be right. Based on what I know as a product manager, this decision that the engineering team made is wrong. But are you going to fight for it? Not always. You're not always going to fight for it. You have to understand in your own head, what is the cost benefit of fighting for that decision, right? It may be good for the product, but you're going to lose that relationship with the engineering manager, right? Yeah, and that trade-off comes in different cases. Not always a product trade-off. Sometimes it's a relationship trade-off. Sometimes it's all different sorts of trade-offs. And so I would say it's more important for you to figure out where you should be involved. You can't be everywhere at once. And if you try to force yourself into a conversation, that has ramifications as well. And so the approach I've taken usually is you can figure out whether your engineering team or your design team is competent. And usually they are, right? It's very rare cases where they can't do the job, right? So let them make the decision. Like, talk to them, like get to know them, build that relationship so that you have some influence. But ultimately let them make that decision, right? There are much more important decisions usually that you need to fight for, and you need to save your points or your, whatever you want to call it, to fight for those more important decisions. You don't want to just fight for everything that you think is right. Is it ultimately about, communicating the vision? If everybody is aligned with what the vision is, then they can make some of these decisions themselves and understand, oh, that's what we're trying to do, so this thing that I propose doesn't make sense. You have no authority. If you want to be able to say that this is what the end user wants, you should have convinced them 6 months ago, right? Don't try to convince them now. It's too late, right? It's too late. They want to do something, and you're like, no. By the way, here's the vision. Like, it's too late. They're not going to believe you at that point. If you did what you said, if you actually communicated the vision early, then at the very least, maybe they won't realize that they're contradicting the vision. But when you bring it up, you're like, oh yeah, we talked about that 6 months ago. You're right, actually. It's easier to convince them. So this concept of alignment, right? Going back to like always have meetings, right? You cannot over-communicate as a product manager. And especially if you're communicating about the vision, every single person, not just the CTO, by the way, literally the engineer down to the lowest level who's working on a particular piece of the feature needs to know what the vision is. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to communicate what the end user needs or what the product needs. And so always communicate, align people around the vision. What you're thinking should not be a mystery to people, right? It shouldn't be like, oh, the weird product manager now just came up with some crazy idea. It should never be like that. They should be like, oh, it's consistent, right? 6 months ago they told me this. 3 months ago they told me this, and now they're saying this. It all makes sense based on the vision that they painted. That should be the conversation. It shouldn't be a surprise to people. It's not just like go away and let them solve the problem. It's also a feedback loop, right? Like when they go away and come up with 3 solutions, they come back to you and ask for your input, right? Is that kind of what you're saying? And you're absolutely right. And that comes back to like being influential and having those relationships, right? Why would they come back to you, right? Again, remember, they don't need to, right? An engineering manager can go off and do his own thing. He might get a slap on the wrist, but he's not going to get fired for that. If you don't have credibility, they don't have to come back to you. But if you've built the right relationship with them, if they trust you, if they understand that you actually add value to the team, then they will take the step and be like, you know what, you can't come to this meeting, but we'll have the meeting, we'll present some options, then I'll come back to you, and then you can figure out, which of these we should be doing, or it should be a discussion, right? Ultimately comes back to how much influence do you have, how much do people trust you? You should be at the front line, so that the way you build that credibility is you are there with the customer, and when you tell the engineering team, it's not just you thought of it in your head, you're like, no, I was there in the front lines with the customer, and here's what I know. It's firsthand information. It's a great point. Cool. I think this is my last slide. This is just kind of to test what we've learned here. Would these people make great PMs? Let's start with Kanye West. Would Kanye West make a good PM? What do you guys think? I would say no. Why? Humility. Kanye only cares about Kanye. What about Abraham Lincoln? Think Abraham Lincoln would make a good PM? Yeah? I think so too. I think he was the one who was good at politics. He became president. But also, I don't know if you guys have read about Abraham Lincoln, but he was someone people understood, right? And people had great respect for him. And people really believed in his vision of America and his vision of what he wanted to do with the country. And those are the skills that you need to be a good product manager. What about Einstein? Really smart guy. How many think he would make a great product manager? Nobody. Oh, poor Einstein. This one I think is a mix, right? Because in some ways, I agree with you. He was kind of weird, right? And maybe not as sociable as you would expect. But at the same time, his ability to take a very complex idea and distill it into terms that people understand, wow, he was really a genius, right? I don't know if you've read any of his work on general relativity, special relativity, but the way he explains it, it just makes sense to you. And I'm not a physics major, I don't understand the math behind it. That skill is actually very rare, and it's, oh my God, it's so useful for a product manager. If you can do that, if you can take all of the information you know and distill it into 3 points on a slide that everybody can remember, you will be a very good product manager, right? So I would say maybe. I won't say no to Albert Einstein if he wants to be a product. I'll give him a shot. Cool, so that's pretty much all I had. Are there any other questions that you guys have? Yeah, so the question is, what is the difference between a product manager and a product owner in an agile environment? I think I'm not equipped to answer that question, and the reason is because I personally have not worked in a company that has product owners, like that title. There may be a role called product owner, but like at Microsoft and at Google, there's no title called product owner. I know some other companies do. I think Amazon does. I'm not sure. My guess is they would be very similar. That would be my guess. Have you seen, is there a company, I actually don't know, is there a company that has both product managers and product owners? Oh, you work in a company, okay. Yeah, unfortunately I can't tell you. So that's a challenge, is that, like I said in the first slide, right, like product manager has no definition. Kind of has a definition, but it's very hard to tell from company to company what you will be doing day to day. And that's why it's really important to ask the company or shadow those people and understand, do they match up with what kind of I was presenting, do they match up with your vision of what a product manager is, or a product owner in your case? So sorry I can't answer that question. Yeah, so the question is, if you are an engineer today and you wanted to transition into product management, should I do it in the same company I'm in today, or should I jump to a different company in a different role? It's always easier to do it in the same company. I'm not saying it's impossible to do it in a different company, but one, I'd be very surprised if someone hired you with no product management experience. Right, and two, it's going to be harder, right? Because again, it comes back to credibility. So I transitioned from software engineering to product management in the same company, and it was easy because people knew who I was. They knew that I could deliver. They knew how I spoke, what I believed in terms of the product, and so it was easier to make that transition. If you come in as a product manager with no product management experience, nobody knows you, I don't know how you're going to get credibility. It's going to be a very, very uphill battle. So it's possible, but for most cases, you're right. Try to transition within the same company, if possible. If not, there's other ways, and you can talk to me after the talk, and I'll tell you some of the ways where you can switch companies and disciplines at the same time.
So,
yeah.
How come? I knew some people they didn't really have a strong background in engineering, and they went to MBA and become product manager.
What do you mean?
How does that work?
Oh, how do people get product management jobs right after MBA?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say it's actually a mixed bag. So one of the reasons is because it's really hard to hire product managers because it's not clear what skills are needed, right? And so an MBA is kind of ironic. In Silicon Valley, people really throw eggs at MBAs, or at least they used to, but we actually hire the most MBAs in the country, like Silicon Valley. So it's kind of ironic. But the reason is I think that there just aren't enough PMs to go around, and they require certain skills. The MBA is the closest thing to any academic degree that would align. I don't think it aligns 100%. I don't even think it aligns 80%, but it's the closest thing. And so it's more of like a supply-demand issue, but also people who get MBAs generally have had work experience in the past. And depending on that work experience, it actually matters whether or not you get that product management role. So if you were doing something totally unrelated and you just got an MBA, I don't think you'd have a lot of success getting a product management role. So they do, like I as an interviewer for product management role, I'd look at that. I'd look at like what is the trajectory? Does it end up in product management? So if you started as an engineer, maybe you managed an engineering team, you got an MBA, you did other things on the side, you built products on the side on your spare time. That to me would be like, okay, check, like let's talk. So just so I understand your question, you're saying if I was a startup founder and I didn't have an engineering background and I applied directly to a product manager role, will I get it?
Yeah.
I think so. And the reason is because, so different companies have different criteria of whether or like how technical you have to be. Google's like to the extreme right, like you must know how to code in order to be a product manager at Google. Microsoft was not like that, Amazon's not like that, a lot of companies are not like that. And so I think you have to appreciate engineering and you have to be able to understand engineers. Do you need to be an engineer? I don't think so. I don't think you need to be an engineer to be a good product manager. And so if you've been a founder, you've already had to deal with engineering. You've already had to make decisions. You've already had to do a lot of the things product managers are going to have to do. So it's a good proxy to say, you know what, he's founded his own company, probably make a decent product manager. It's not a big stretch to say that, even if they don't have an engineering background. So it sounds like there's two questions. The first question was, what percentage of the time is spent on new products and coming up with new ideas and new products versus existing products? The second question was, from a day-to-day perspective, what does it mean to work on an existing product? Is that the right summary? Okay, so to answer the first question, I wouldn't phrase it in terms of new products. Ultimately, sometimes you have a product, but you're making the next evolution in that product. Like, would you consider that a new product? No, but it's still new enough that it requires a product manager, right? So if you're coming up with, Android, whatever, 12.0 or whatever, that's fundamentally different than Android 11. You're going to need a product manager. Is it a new product? I don't know if you classify that. So if you consider it, if you take a look at it in that lens of how much of your time is spent looking forward, ideally it should be 100%. In reality, it's probably 70 to 80%, depending on the company and depending on the timeline. Ultimately, the things that are already being executed on, you should have defined very, very well, right? You should have been like, these are the specifications, this is the vision, this is what we're doing, and that should have been enough to get people to execute on it and to deliver it. In reality, that's almost never the case because you're not perfect and you haven't foreseen all the different edge cases. So that's why it goes from 100% to 70 to 80%. Working on existing products, it doesn't mean that you're just tracking things that are going on, right? It's like you're not necessarily a person who manages the schedule and the timeline. So you're not just looking at what's happening. You're trying to anticipate what's going to happen after what we've defined today ships. What's next, right? You have to be one step ahead of everybody else on the team because most of the people on the team are focusing on that next deadline, and you're focusing on, well, when they're done that deadline, what do they do next, right? The worst thing as a product manager you can do is be hyper-focused on what they're shipping now, because as soon as they finish, they're going to be like, what's next? And you're going to be like, I don't know, I didn't think about that, right? So you have to be one step ahead. On the day-to-day, what that means is, let's say your product ships every quarter, like just a random example. So this quarter, you would have already decided that here's what we're going to do this quarter. Here's all the milestones, here's what we're shipping. And then your time in this quarter is mostly going to be worried about quarter 2 or quarter 3 or whatever, right? And then your team will be executing, but you will be thinking about, okay, so what additions are we going to add? What are we going to change? Looking at user data from the current iteration of the product that's out there. So it's always kind of forward-looking, regardless of whether it's existing or new product. and you always still have to think about the strategic angle. Even if it's an existing product with billions of users, you still have to think in the same forward-looking, future, what's next, type of attitude. So the question is like, why did I do it personally? It's a good question. I think there's a couple of reasons, and I'll be honest. Some of the glamour appealed to me too initially. It turned out to be wrong, by the way, just to let you guys know. The glamour there's not much glamour in the role. But ultimately, the reason I decided to go forward with it was because when I was doing my own startups, the most exciting part, the part that really made me jump out of bed in the morning and go to work, was talking to customers, right? It was talking to people using my product and being like, oh, did you enjoy it? Seeing the smile on their face, right? That was ultimately what made me excited. And I don't know if I was a good programmer or not. I think I was, hopefully. So it wasn't necessarily that, oh, I suck at programming, I can't do it. There are some people that, by the way, think that way. And my advice to them is like, no, get good at something, right? Don't just try to use product management to escape from whatever you're bad at. Like, you don't know if you're going to be good at product management either, and then what are you going to do, right? It's a pretty difficult decision to transition. So to summarize, personally, I did it because I liked being as close as possible to the customer.
Okay, my question is very simple. Just like I go through your slide, and your daily activity is very similar to what I do for like a project management
Oh, okay.
or program management.
Right.
So how do you differentiate from the project management and the product management?
Right.
It's very funny. A lot of people already feel project manager sometimes is useless, and the product manager is even worse.
Yeah.
So how do you differentiate with these two positions?
Yeah. Yeah, good question. For what it's worth, I think project managers have an easier time justifying their value than product managers. But what is the difference between project, program, and product management? One thing I'll say is sometimes it differs from company to company. So Microsoft, for example, they just have program managers. Some program managers are actually product managers. Other program managers are program managers. Some program managers are project managers. I don't know why they have just one title, but they do. But if we were to just speak about strict definitions, if I were to split them up in my head, the way I would differentiate is product managers, again, are always looking to the future of what do we do next. They shouldn't be involved too much on the timeline aspect of it, the resourcing aspect of it, and they shouldn't be too focused on managing ongoing programs, right? So you might imagine there's a program, every month you meet with a customer and you do XYZ, right? That's not a product role. I would say that's a program manager role, right? Even though they're talking to the customer, right? It's still a program manager role because it's ongoing and it's not like a vision for a product or what does the product go next? Those kind of questions fall into the product bucket. Program is more about ongoing engagements, right? Whether it's customer related or not. Sometimes program managers also take up the schedule side of things as well. Other times there's a dedicated person called a project manager, and the project manager's role is a very important role, which is understanding when can we ship this product, who needs to be involved, and what are the dependencies, what are all the teams involved, and how do we make sure that we align the product such that it can actually ship on a certain date. So that task is usually not the product manager doing it. Sometimes the program manager, always the project manager. Does that help divide the three roles? Cool, thanks. Yeah, that's a good question. So how do you transition to product management from marketing? I know someone who did that. It's hard. I think it's harder. I think it's unfairly harder. I think people in marketing and sales have a lot to add as a product manager, but for some reason or another, it's harder for them to transition than engineering, for example. But how do you do it? I would say the biggest hurdle I've seen, the biggest hesitation for someone to hire a sales or a marketing person as a product manager is that they feel they don't have the technical chops. Right? So if you can make people feel more at ease about that, you can learn coding on the side, or you don't even have to go that far. Just create something on the side that you've built yourself, right? I don't think you need to convince people that you know how to talk to customers, right? That's what you do. You understand the customer. That's your job already. So you don't have to double down on that. You have to figure out what are the other skills that I don't do in my job that I can show people. So if you built something from the ground up, or maybe you partnered with an engineer and you built something, that's something you can show and be like, hey, I'm really good at the customer side of things, but I also did this. So it's not that I'm completely clueless about the other things. That to me is the number one thing I would look for. If you came from sales, marketing, whatever, and you had built something yourself, end to end, launched it, I would be like, yeah, you got all the skills. So that's probably the easiest way, I would say.
Yeah, what would you say, so what would you say is kind of like the future of the product management role? Like what are some tasks or like responsibilities that you see that you're using less and less of, or things that that you think you'll be doing more and more that you're not doing as much?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. I would say because product management is kind of a newish role, like it's like decades old, but relative to engineering, for example, it's a new role. It's evolved a lot, and it's continuing to evolve. I would say the more you focus on the long-term vision and business side of things, the better. So there used to be a time where product managers would be very involved in scrums and agile and figuring out development methodologies. I think slowly we're transitioning away from that. At smaller companies that don't have a lot of dedicated roles, like they just don't have enough people, product manager ends up doing a lot of those things. But if you were to go to a big company that specializes in product management, well, guess what? They're going to have engineering managers, they're going to have program managers, they're going to have project managers. And so you won't be able to get to do those things because there's going to be dedicated people who do the other things. So focus on kind of understanding strategy, focus on understanding the people side of it, relationships, how to manage, how to have influence without any authority. Focus on the business side of things, like business models, understanding how do you make money from a product, how do you grow a product, right? Those are the skills that are going to last you forever as a product manager. And things that are more tactical, things that are more about like how do we do this more efficiently, those are things that I think slowly are getting taken away from the discipline. Still important, by the way, to learn them if you have time. But I would just say if you were to pick one or the other, I think what I said originally is more important than kind of the tactical stuff. Does that make sense? Cool. The question is like, you're a new product manager and you have this great idea, like you've looked at some data and you're like, oh man, the user really needs this. And you want to get opinions from engineering and design, but they don't know who you are. So you can't just walk up to them and be like, hey, listen to me, right? Because you don't have any credibility or influence. So how do you manage that? I would say if you're a new product manager, try to focus on the low-hanging fruit first, right? There are some problems that everybody in the team knows about, right? For example, the app, people are complaining about X, or every third week a new news story comes out about this part of the app sucks, right? Those are things that everybody knows about, but they can't solve because one, they don't have the time, or two, it's not an easy solution. Focus on those first, right? If you're a new product manager, the number one thing you should do is build your credibility. You won't be able to just come in and change the product and make it amazing on day one. It's not possible, right? Because you have no authority. So I'd say focus on that first. Now, assuming that maybe it's not day one, maybe it's a month in or 4 months in, and you've built some credibility. How do you then schedule that meeting? I would say once you've built up those relationships and you've built up that influence, then it shouldn't come as a surprise that you're trying to get people in a room to do this, right? You should already have that mindset when you talk to people, like when you take the engineering manager out to lunch, he should know you're thinking about this stuff, right? He should know that it didn't just come from left field, that you woke up at night and you're like, I'm going to look at some data now, and then you came up with this idea. Like, if he thinks that's what you're doing, he's not going to listen to you. But if he thinks that, hey, this person has been spending the last 4 months understanding the user, understanding the data, then it makes sense. Like, okay, yeah, he spent the time or she spent the time looking at the data and is now able to make that decision. So if it comes as a surprise, you're not going to get that meeting. Just build that reputation over time and make sure that you're kind of conveying to people that you're constantly doing this and that it's not just some crazy idea you came up with. Hopefully they'll listen to you, and data always helps. So always bring data. Have I ever been in a meeting when I was transitioning from software to product where something was brought up that was out of my scope? Yeah, I would say every single day, right? Every single day I'm in a meeting where I'm like, oh, I don't know about that topic. What do I do, right? And you have to be smart about it. You can't just be like raising your hand every 5 minutes asking what's that, right? Because you have credibility to uphold. But you have to understand what's worth digging into. So for example, you might be sitting in an engineering meeting and they'll mention like 5 different 3-letter acronyms. And it's like, well, yeah, you could go and ask them about every single one of those, but how much of that really matters to why you're in the meeting, right? They might be just discussing with themselves, like let them have at it. There's some things that you really need to understand. And for those things, I would say if it's critical enough to the decision, bring it up during the meeting. So, you know, if sometimes I'm in a meeting with legal, right, and they bring up something, some legal law or clause, and I'm like, I don't know what that is. Can you describe it to me? And that's okay, right? That's okay. They see that you're trying to understand their point of view, so that'll help. In other cases, it's something that you should have known but don't, right? So for some reason, you know, it's something that's very critical to the product, but you just didn't know it. And in that case, you don't want to hijack the meeting and be like, hey guys, I'm the only one in the meeting who doesn't know this. Can somebody explain it to me? Like, it's a waste of everybody else's time, right? So in those cases, what I would do is I would go to the person or somebody else after and be like, hey, by the way, I feel very rusty on this side of the, you know, like the design process, or I feel very rusty about this marketing plan. Could you just go over it with me? Like, let's take 30 minutes. Like, again, like, be humble, right? Be humble about it. Like, they don't have to help you, but if you come to them and you say, hey, it's my fault, I don't know it, but I'd really like to borrow your time, then they'll appreciate that. So that's how I would approach those scenarios. So the question is, with the pace of how things move and change in an agile world, how do you as a product manager think about the long-term vision, strategic vision, when everything is changing every day? Is that right? If you've set your vision right and you've done your research, it should not change every day. Things will change every day. You'll get new information every day. You'll get new data from your users. But your 5-year vision should not change every day. If it is, you don't know how to vision, right? It should be generic enough that it's not like a specific bet, like this is going to happen, right? It shouldn't be that specific. At the same time, it should be well informed enough that, like, if that's kind of your vision, you should be able to come at it from many different angles, right? So you may realize that what you're doing next week is wrong, but that doesn't mean that your 5-year plan is wrong, right? By the way, I'm just using 5-year as an example. I don't actually come up with 5-year plans. That's really far ahead. I might have an idea, but that's not kind of the vision. So my advice there would be, one, in situations where there is a lot of information that's changing over time, like when I worked at a startup, that was every day, right? Every day I wake up, I read 5 news articles, and I'm like, oh man, we're gonna fail. Or like, oh man, we're gonna be successful, right? Like, that's how it is. And in those cases, your strategy should not change, but your prioritization will change. And the challenge then becomes, how do you communicate that to the rest of your team, right? So there's different ways of doing it, right? Sometimes teams have stand-ups, and maybe as part of that stand-up process, you could be like, hey, by the way, I heard from a customer that this is not important, so we could pull that down. That's one way of like doing day-to-day changes. In other ways, sometimes there's, you know, scheduled meetings with the broader team about strategy. So maybe like once a month or once every 4 months. And then you can kind of collect all the things that you think need to change and then bring it up in that meeting and say, here's, like, present it very well, communicate it very well, that this is what I've heard, these are all the changes, and this is how it impacts the product. So that's kind of how I've done it in the past. But at the same time, right, like, if there's new information and everybody knows there's new information, then they're not going to fault you for changing, you know, pulling the rug from under them. But if they believe that you're just being indecisive, right? If they don't know the data behind your change of heart, then they're just like that product manager, like every day he comes up with a different idea that's totally opposite of what was yesterday. And then you're just going to lose credibility. So just always over-communicate, right? Like, hey guys, I just talked to a customer. Like, send out an email, right? If you get new information and it changes something, send out an email. Be like, hey guys, I just talked to a customer, and here's like a 3-line summary of what I learned. And people will appreciate that. You know, you might think like, oh, I'm distracting the engineers, or I'm, not letting them code. But engineers want to know why they're building what they're building. They're not robots, right? They want to understand why you're coming up with these decisions. They want to be sold on the product. And so it's your job to communicate that. Do product managers do marketing? It depends. Again, like, product manager is kind of this wild card role. If you don't have marketing on your team, yeah, you're going to do marketing because nobody else is going to do it. In a traditional big company like Google, Microsoft, no, you wouldn't do product marketing. You'd be involved in it for sure. I mean, ultimately, the marketing is going to come to you and be like, all right, we need to sell this product. Why did you think people want it, right? Tell me three line items why people want it. It's quicker, it's faster, it's more efficient, whatever it is, right? And then marketing's job is kind of to figure out, okay, product guy told me this. This is how I actually present it to people out there in the world, right? So I would say in smaller companies and startups, you probably have to do marketing. In big companies, you still have to understand how marketing works, because you're going to be talking to marketing, And if you don't know what they're going to do with the information you tell them, you're probably going to tell them the wrong information. And then you're going to be like, oh, my product didn't do well, and it's marketing's fault. No, it's your fault. You should have known what marketing was going to do. You should have been involved in it.